So we read in the Christian Gospels that God is love. What is the relationship between love and rationality to your mind? And are either of them, love or rationality, a suitable substitute for God as society's guiding ideal?
This is an interesting question because rationality in particular is understood in different ways. And I'm not even sure myself which notions I prefer. I mean, there's a broad sense of rationality as, which could almost be understood as very similar to wisdom, which is something just like figuring out what to do or how to live in a very broad sense and knowing your limits and things like that. I don't know that that definition is super helpful. There's a much narrower sense of rationality, which treats it as means-ends analysis. So you set an objective, and then so setting the objective, at least the very high level, is sort of irrational. It comes from somewhere or whatever. It's not subject to any rational constraints. Once you have that objective, then rationality is the process of achieving that objective within various constraints, or using the lowest resources or time or something like that. That's a very narrow definition of rationality. I'm personally maybe somewhere in between the very broad and the very narrow definitions of what rationality is. And so partly that how you conceive of rationality is going to then affect how you answer this question. I think if you take rationality to be almost similar to wisdom in a very broad way, like I think some philosophers do, then love is probably going to be an aspect of that, presumably because if you think that having some sort of positive pro-social regard for other people and animals is an important aspect of wisdom or sort of self-actualization as a person, then if you think rationality in a quite broad way, then you might think that sort of the rational person finds in themselves love for others, at least after reflection and acting in the world or something like that.
But what about love making you more rational, or being loving, or having a loving disposition?
Well, that would go the other way. I'm not really sure about that, to be honest. I guess, yeah, I hadn't thought so much about that. There are what I'll say is there are certainly a lot of people in the world who seem to be very loving as a disposition, as in having a strong regard for other people, caring deeply about them, showing empathy, and following that up with actions and doing a lot of things, who nevertheless I would not describe as very rational. I mean, lives of many Christian saints might come to mind in this. And I think that, I mean, as part of the effective altruism movement, for example, we have pretty strong views about the need to combine love as a sort of a feeling or pro-social attitude with pretty rigorous and careful epistemic practices so that we can channel, if you like, that love into ways that are actually helpful to other people. I think one can feel love and have genuine love and act it out, but in a way that is, in a sense, not rational, in not achieving the object of helping other people or doing good in the world or achieving your aims very effectively. Or sometimes you can even be counterproductive. You can actually be hurting people, but not realizing it. So I guess you might say that if you really care about others and are sufficiently introspective, you'll be driven to address those questions like, am I really helping the poor or the needy? Or am I just sort of fooling myself into thinking that I am? Mother Teresa is someone who's been criticized on this grounds about exactly what her motives were. And Christopher Hitchens has been very critical of her. And, it's hard to assess people like that when you don't know, you can't see into their soul. But I think that ideally love should press us to be more rational, to try to use the tools at our disposal to do the things that we're motivated to do to help others. And, I'd say that that's what rationality is about, at least in part, is the sort of means-ends analysis thing. That's at least part of it. And, challenging yourself and rethinking positions and asking yourself what the evidence is, things like that. So, I mean, I think ideally there's an interaction between the two. I don't know if in practice that really happens very much, though.
You don't,
to be honest.
That's interesting, because in my experience, there's a very, very profound connection between the two.
How do you see that?
Well, first of all, I'll just recognize that you and I both clearly have a love of learning.
Yeah,
that is a passion. There's an emotion. There's an affective and emotional element to that. There's a joyfulness that comes from that. And there are various associated desires of helping people, etc., which, again, not totally selfless. I mean, there's a romance with history, with learning languages. I think that, look, okay, so it's obvious that being healthy is important for being rational. Obviously, if you are in very declining health, or if you're in a very bad psychological state, you'll find it hard to just think and function properly.
Yeah.
So in that generic sense, obviously in that generic sense, like health and rationality, but I think there's something specific about love, which is love and rationality are both combined by a sense of general openness, a kind of generous or compassionate curiosity about things and about the world, a sense of wonderment, a sense of enchantment or intoxication with life and with learning, a sense of inclusiveness, that you're just more open and willing to consider things in general. If you are hateful, spiteful, closed off, emotionally hurt, you can see how that restricts your range of interest. Now, I understand this is trespassing a little bit into the terrain of health, including mental health. But I do think that when I have been of a more loving disposition in general, I have had a greater openness, curiosity, willingness to engage, but also just psychological mental energy to do various activities. Things which would be a sacrifice or a burden become a passion, etc. So again, I mean, a cynic here could say we're just talking about health. This is about physical and psychological well-being. But I do think that there's something deeper and more profound here, because reason may not be the slave of the passions, as Hume said, but there is a strong relationship there. And I don't know about you, but for instance, for me, I have a great love of learning of etymology and learning words in other languages that are novel concepts. That's a great love of mine. So love can be used in a variety of ways. But I think that the dissociation of rationality from love or from any other human feeling is certainly something people are afraid of, and for good reason. And you can imagine like the hyper-rationality of algorithms or non-human entities making decisions without taking into consideration people's feelings could be very frightful. I can't explain it very well because it's a very experiential thing, but I'll just say that my being curious, pro-social, and having a loving disposition, I think enhances my rationality, and the opposite is also the case.
Yeah, that's interesting. I guess I'm not convinced that that's generally true of people. I mean, it may be true for some people. I think, I mean, there are interesting analogs from history, obviously, about heinous actions that have been pursued in some sense very rationally, although depending on how, again, depends how you deploy that word. But if you at least think of it in terms of, say, means ends analysis, you can think of, well, war is actually a good example of this. War has been described many times as sort of, in some ways, the pinnacle of human rationality, as well as the antithesis of human rationality. You think about all of the ingenuity that goes into devising more efficient means of killing and achieving battlefield objectives. And it's fascinating. I'm interested in the military history of war and the tactics and strategy. There's so much to learn. It's very interesting from that intellectual point of view.
And it informs game theory, and yeah.
Yeah, I mean, there are also applications outside of it as well, which is interesting. But I guess from maybe a deeper point of view, it represents a failure of human rationality, because every conflict has some endpoint, and the destruction that's wrought to achieve that endpoint is just a waste. It's a failure of human rationality to achieve some negotiated compromise that achieves that outcome without all the destruction that is wrought in the meantime, not to mention all of the poor reasons there are for war, such as mistrust and prejudice and greed and other things that are in some sense irrational. So, I mean, obviously there's a lot to unpack there in terms of the many aspects and the ways we're deploying the words there, but it seems to me that it's just very hard to pin down a particular relationship between love and rationality because of examples like war, where it seems on the one hand that you can describe them as supremely rational, and on the other hand, supremely irrational. And even in the case of war, in war we have great manifestations of love and also of hate, right? So it's, I don't know, it seems there's a lot going on there.
So okay, I'm going to go into it.
Well, we don't have to if you don't want to go there right now.
No. I'm just thinking if this is but no, I think it is, because this doesn't get brought up enough. There is a kind of paradox of duality, or the paradox of non-duality, which is there's a theme in religious and philosophical discourses, this idea of duality, the body and the mind, the soul and the body, and so on, but also self and other. If there are assuming there are no other forms of like real duality, there is at least one form of duality we know exists without a doubt, and it's not the one that Descartes thought that, you know, it is what I call the paradox of non-duality, which is that it is possible to simultaneously experience the world as being alien and distinct from you, and to have a non-dual awareness where, for instance, you just imagine it. This might sound a little hippie, but it's important to convey the affective, the qualia of the experience here. Imagine you're sitting outside and you're breathing in, and you hear the trees rustling, and you feel that what they're exhaling, you're inhaling, and vice versa, and you feel like you're one with the ecosystem. You're all a part of an organism, and I see you, and I see other people, and everyone appears to be a different face or manifestation of the universe. It's like you're identified with everything, and everything is a part of you, and so you have a sort of compassion or care for yourself, which is then extended to the rest of the world. That's one way of describing a non-dual experience. It can happen as a consequence of meditative states. It can happen under the influence of certain pharmaceuticals, psychedelics in particular. It can happen in experience of love between two people, for instance. Obviously, you know, when people in love, the world seems to be kind of a brighter place, and people just kind of be spontaneously more benevolent. And there is this sense of an evaporation between the distinction between self and other. Ego consciousness becomes less of a burden. Things feel more spontaneous, free-flowing. Now, there's a pathological dimension. There's a pathological version of that, which Freud associated with this infantile regression to infantile consciousness, which you call a kind of oceanic experience, where you just can't differentiate between anything. You know, imagine someone is tripping off their mind, and they're just like, "I love you, man," is hugging strangers, all the rest. So there's a pathological variety of it, but there is also, I think, a profoundly rational aspect of it, which is to feel oneself not alienated from the world and from other people, and to see others and the world itself as, in some sense, a reflection of what is, to see in other things and other people a reflection of what you value about yourself. Now, the paradox of non-duality is it's possible to both go into that state and out of that state. And so I think that's associated with what I mean when I'm talking about this relationship between love and rationality, because, for instance, when you're depressed, isolated, anxious, especially when you're anything which can be described under the label alienated, it's very easy to view the universe as external, indifferent, dead, irrelevant, unrelatable, absurd, disinteresting, nihilistic, etc. And behaving callously, thoughtlessly, destructively with that emotional disposition comes naturally to you, and it can be quite irrational, both epistemically. It's epistemically irrational in the sense that you're having a distorted map of the universe, and it is instrumentally irrational in as much as it will harm your relationships with others and it will obstruct you achieving your goals. So perhaps that changes your mind a little.
Yeah, yes, I see what you're saying there. I guess one concern I have is that I don't think that we're restricted. Well, I shouldn't say we. I don't think that the two cases are simply of having generally pro-social positive attitudes towards people or maybe life in general, or versus the opposite of that you articulated as feeling withdrawn and cynical, disinterested, and negative, and so forth. At least in my reading of things, much of the challenge of human history is in othering, of having those positive attitudes towards one group of people and very negative attitudes combined with an element of negative attitudes and disinterest towards other groups of people. And I think that a lot of wars, discrimination, prejudice, and things are accounted for in that. And that's one of the reasons I'm a bit reticent about the saying anything very specific about the relationship between love and rationality, because I think, well, actually, there's a movie that came out very recently that sort of explored this issue in a way. In the case of the Holocaust, I'm trying to remember what A Zone of Interest is what it was called, where it portrays I don't know if you've heard about it, but it portrays a family life in in terms of their children and home and things, home environment of the commandant of Auschwitz. And you don't actually see in the camp, but they're right next to it, and it explores this sort of duality of the sort of, well, love and evil in some ways, right? And the point is that I think that, I mean, humans do have this sort of dual aspect of where we can be very good in some contexts and very horrible in other contexts. And I don't know if you were to ask, well, which of those is sort of more rational? It depends how we're going to cash out the notion of rationality. But I don't know if I'm comfortable in saying just straightforwardly that it's always more comfortable, or it always is better, it goes better for us or for our immediate circle when we adopt a broad pro-social attitude. Like sometimes it's the opposite. Sometimes you'll be persecuted for for fighting for what's right.
And history has lots of mystics with the kind of universal love, non-dual consciousness who end up getting persecuted.
Who haven't haven't done well for it. So I just think that there's a lot more to play there.
Well, I mean, it certainly seems if rationality becomes dissociated from yes, I mean, I suppose the question then becomes, to what extent can we generalize about love or dissociate it from things like pleasure or joy? But I do think, well, I'll put it this way, because I'm trying to see what common ground exists between the religious and atheistic standpoint. And, if a religious person said to me, look, the feeling of love is associated with that which is of divine worth, I'd say, sure, we tend to love those things we regard as being of divine worth. If they said what is of divine worth is beyond our knowing, we can't know how valuable a human life is. Okay, So I think there are some fundamental intuitions, part of the religious worldview, that make sense at a lower level of resolution. The challenge comes when they become dogmatized and they take on a doctrinal form where all kinds of qualifications are put in there. But I think there are some fundamental intuitions amongst religious people that make a certain instrumental sense. It's one of the reasons people stay religious, I think, is, for instance, if you come from a loving family that also happens to be religious, that can be enough for some people to replicate the religion in the next generation. It's complicated. I'm not trying to reduce everything to kinship dynamics, but I asked, the second part of that question is, are either of them, rationality or love, a suitable alternative to God as society's guiding ideal? And this is interesting because, take for instance the political ideal of meritocracy. We could say what makes someone meritorious is how useful they are to contributing to the social surplus. Or we could say what makes somebody meritorious is how caring their labor is. Or we could combine those two. There are a variety of ways of measuring economic performance. There are varieties of ways of measuring merit, some of which will be more economistic than others. And so this love and rationality, or care and rationality, or compassion and rationality as a pair of seeming opposites takes on an interesting political dimension. People who believe in God often, famously, there is the metaphor of God with the sun. I think it was C.S. Lewis who said, God is like the sun. I can't look at him, but without him, I can't see anything. So it's the source of illumination.
It illuminates everything else.
Yeah. So, I mean, do we need a value or an ideal or a principle that is like that? And I will just throw in there as well. There is a fascinating 20th century philosopher and Christian apologist, René Girard, who associates God with the repudiation of the scapegoating, the scapegoat principle. And Satan or the devil is associated with scapegoating. So in this sense, the highest value of Christianity would be the repudiation of scapegoating. And that's what redemption or salvation, specifically, that's what Christ's atonement does. Is it? He's the final sacrifice. He is the scapegoat who undoes scapegoating. Therefore, we don't need to scapegoat anymore. So that you could say, a Christian could say that's the highest value of Christianity, And that is an interesting guiding value, the undoing of scapegoating. But yes, do we need a kind of value or a set of values? And how multiplicious can those values be which guide society? I think a fear of a lot of monotheistic and monotheistically inclined people is this too much diversity of values as just a recipe for chaos.
I think we do need values or principles to replace a belief in God. I don't think it has to be one value or principle.
Well, how hierarchical and structured do you think they ought to be?
They being what exactly?
Society's guiding principles. It's bedrock principles, or it's.
Well, that's difficult to answer in the abstract, I think. I don't know that it has to be hierarchical. I think it should be fairly normative. So in that sense, I think, well, I mean, it depends if we're talking about the impact of the state as such. I mean, that's probably a bit outside what we want to talk about here, but I don't necessarily mean hierarchical in just in a sense of what the state does. I think that we should, we as a society, so as citizens, as friends, as parents, family members, and so forth, as consumers as well, we should seek to promote certain norms quite strongly, though I don't necessarily mean by literal use of force. Sometimes that's necessary. And what norms should we be promoting? Well, I mean, anything that I say is not going to be especially novel there. We should promote norms of compassion, curiosity, inclusion, epistemic humility, open-mindedness, academic rigor in many contexts. I think society could do a bit more of that. And pro-social norms, all sorts of the sort of good stuff like that. That
rationality is up there.
And rationality will be one of those, yes. So these are the sorts of norms and principles that I think we should promote as a society. I think that they should be promoted quite sort of extensively in many contexts, and much more than I think they are. But I don't know that has to come in a hierarchical way. I think that ideally that comes in a very, maybe some degree of hierarchy, but also in a bottom-up way as well, in a holistic way, I guess, throughout society, that society should be suffused with our attempts to do better at adhering to these norms. I don't think we need to have a single framework for drawing all of those together like traditional religions try to provide. I don't think there is any such thing. Speaking from a sort of metaphysical naturalist point of view, but I also don't think such a thing is necessary. I think different people can sort of tell different stories, develop different narratives for their own lives or sub-communities that they engage in, subject to certain constraints, obviously, of rationality and other things. Not every story is going to sort of work or be as defensible, but there are many ways to make sense of your life and how you relate to the world. And I think that we can embrace a diversity of those as long as they're sort of broadly consistent with sort of some of the basic principles that I mentioned.
Well, one of the reasons that love and rationality would be contrasted, especially in our Western philosophical tradition, is because of the Kantian ideas of the ethical as being about duty.
Yeah.
And there's clearly an interesting relationship between love and the ethical, because it's far easier to be ethical toward people and things which you have some love for, some care for, than things which you don't. And so it seems instrumentally rational that if you could expand that sense of an inclusive consciousness or a loving consciousness to include more things, that would be less burdensome and therefore more rational a way of engaging with the world on an ethical basis than forcing yourself to go through with all of your duties. I mean, reducing the extent to which your ethical commitments are burdensome is itself an ethical priority. And I believe that has to do with the manner in which you relate to those values. I think that there's a relational dimension to values in a way that is more than metaphorical to how we relate to other people. If you reflect on what's value about what you're doing, if you make it, let's say you make a presentation, but you beautify it, so you try and really draw people's attention to it. If you get into a nice mood, if you try and work smart rather than working hard, you're taking a loving attitude to your work, you can get farther with it, which can make ethical commitments less burdensome. And so I do think that is a clear connection between the two.
Between love and rationality.
Yes, yeah. Specifically love being in service of rationality. And I think, again, this idea of an inclusive consciousness and openness, people tend to take these psychological traits for granted, but I'm speaking partly from experience here. Someone who's, when I've had severe depression, there's just a closing off in terms of my curiosity and
Yeah.
compassion toward both people and things, even things which are valuable to me. Suddenly, their value becomes abstract. It's like I can't relate to it anymore on a personal level. It's very strange. But I don't think this is reducible to health. A huge problem with our society is we tend to view ethics and rationality both in terms of health rather than as relational dynamics to do with other values such as inclusivity, compassion, empathy, etc. Anyway, put that all to a side. Can of worms.